For the past 2.5 years, I've called the far north of the Scottish Highlands my home. A place of striking beauty where the endless horizon meets rugged cliffs. When I moved to Caithness, to the northernmost town of Thurso, I thought I'd found a dream: untouched nature, wildlife, and the enchanting northern lights. But the dream didn't last. The longer I stayed, the more I uncovered a side of this place that few speak about: a shadowy, cursed undercurrent that haunts these lands. It started innocently enough. One gray afternoon, just months after settling in, I ventured east from Thurso. The rain was relentless, and my dog, Maisie, and I found ourselves near the ruins of an old castle. What we found there still lingers in my mind: dozens of seabirds, their lifeless bodies strewn across the shore, as though the storm had claimed them all at once. At first, I thought it was just a tragic consequence of nature. But something about that sight felt wrong, like the place itself was warning me. The next day, a local woman approached me as I walked Maisie. Her dog, eerily identical to mine, tugged at her leash. She told me, almost frantically, about an outbreak of avian flu that had wiped out the birds. There was an urgency in her tone, almost as if she was trying to tell me more but couldn't. That wasn't the last strange encounter. The following summer brought me face to face with something far worse. Along the shores of Thurso Bay, amidst a tangle of seaweed, lay a skeleton unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its top half was completely stripped of flesh, leaving bare, clean bones. Yet the bottom half remained almost intact, the fur wet and glistening unnaturally. It was horrifying. It looked staged. Not the work of the elements, but something else. There was something disturbingly ritualistic about its placement. That day stayed with me, casting a shadow over the months that followed. And soon, my life spiraled into turmoil: unexpected losses, health problems, and fractured relationships. It was as though the skeleton had carried with it a curse. The most unsettling discovery came months later, during a bleak winter walk. It was Boxing Day, and the holiday cheer had long faded in the biting wind. My trail led to an abandoned port, the remains of crumbled stone houses and old fishing boats scattered around like ghosts of a bygone era. On the shore, I saw it. What I first thought was a rock turned out to be a seal pup. But something was horribly wrong. Its body was torn apart, with a jagged bite in its side, and its skull was completely missing. Nearby, I found another: identical wounds, identical absence of the skull. It was beyond disturbing, unmistakable evidence of something larger at play. Over time, I began to feel the weight of this place, its beauty tainted by something darker. Caithness, with its vast landscapes and open skies, can feel like a sanctuary to some. But for others, it becomes a prison. I've met locals who share my unease. Those who've stayed here often describe a feeling of being trapped. It's hard to explain, but it's real. As though the land itself resents your presence. Caithness isn't what it seems. Beneath its picturesque exterior lies an untold story of unease, darkness, and despair. If you ever visit, enjoy its beauty, respect its history, and leave before it takes more from you than you realize. I remember it like it was yesterday, January 2008, my first year of B.Tech. The excitement of starting college was still fresh, but so were the nerves. I was learning to adapt to a new world of assignments, exams, and the rhythm of campus life. It was an ordinary morning, or so I thought, but it ended up being anything but. The day started like any other. I had my annual Viva exam and left the house early, bracing against the light drizzle and cold morning air. Since I was still new to riding my two-wheeler, I was extra cautious, especially on rainy days. The slippery roads only made me more nervous. As I rode along the road, navigating the patches of mud and potholes, I noticed a woman standing by the roadside. She was middle-aged, wearing a sari, and appeared to be struggling to walk. I slowed down, wondering if she needed help. Sure enough, she waved at me and gestured for a lift. Initially, I hesitated. Riding with someone behind me, especially on a slippery, uneven road, was something I wasn't confident about. But despite my reservations, I eventually gave in. She seemed so earnest, and I thought it wouldn't hurt to help her out. It was just a short distance, after all. She climbed onto the bike, sitting sideways, and I started riding again, even more cautiously than before. I remember glancing at her in the rearview mirror and asking where she needed to go. What she said next caught me off guard. Her answer wasn't a location, it was, "Where you have to go." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I told myself it was probably just a coincidence, or maybe I had misunderstood her meaning. But something about the way she said it made me uneasy. I kept my focus on the road, convincing myself not to overthink it. The silence between us stretched on as we rode. The rain had eased up slightly, but the strange tension lingered, making the short journey feel much longer. When we reached a small clearing, she told me to stop. Relieved that the ride was over, I pulled over to the side of the road. I turned back to ask her if she needed further help, but she wasn't there. The seat behind me was empty. I looked around, confused, scanning the road and the area around us. But there was no sign of her, not a single footprint on the muddy road, not a trace. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. My heart raced, and my hands trembled on the handlebars. For a few seconds, I just sat there, frozen. Then, in a panic, I grabbed my phone and called my mom. I blurted out the story, still shaken. She half joked that I had given a ghost a lift, but the tone of her voice betrayed her unease. I don't know who or what she was. To this day, I've never seen her again. But I can't forget her words or how she disappeared. It's a story that stayed with me, one I'll never fully understand. Have you ever experienced something like this? Share your story in the comments below. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. Not the gentle quiet of a peaceful evening, but a suffocating, unnatural silence, as if the world had held its breath just for me. It was late, too late for anyone sensible to be wandering outside, but I had never claimed to be sensible. I had taken the long route home, a narrow, winding road that cut through a patch of woods. It was supposed to save me time, a shortcut recommended by someone who probably never traveled it at night. My phone's battery had died hours ago, and without its artificial glow, I was left with the faint light of the moon breaking through skeletal branches. Every step I took seemed louder than it should have been, the crunch of leaves and twigs amplified tenfold. The road stretched endlessly, each turn revealing only more darkness. My steps grew slower, hesitating. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely illuminated by the moonlight. My heart seized and I stopped, hoping they hadn't noticed me. But they didn't move. They simply stood there, motionless. I squinted, trying to make out details. Was it a person? Or a shadow playing tricks on my mind? I forced myself forward, pretending I hadn't seen anything. As I passed the spot where the figure had been, I couldn't help but glance back. It was gone. Relief flooded through me for all of 2 seconds before the hairs on my neck bristled. The air felt different, heavier, as if something was watching me. Panic started to creep in, but I pushed it down. Rationality would keep me safe, I told myself. So I quickened my pace, my eyes fixed straight ahead. And that's when I heard it, the soft crunch of leaves behind me. Someone, or something, was following. Just keep walking, I muttered under my breath. My rational mind offered solutions. A stray animal, the echo of my own steps. But deep down, I knew better. I wasn't alone. The road seemed endless, each step an eternity. The sound behind me grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was had abandoned any pretense of subtlety. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I resisted. Running would make me prey. Then the air changed again. The crisp autumn chill was replaced by something warm, putrid. The scent was faint at first, but it grew stronger with each breath. Decay. My stomach churned as I fought the urge to gag. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. It stood in the middle of the road, a twisted mockery of a human shape. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles. Its skin glistened, slick with something that glimmered darkly under the moonlight. Its head, there was no face. Just a smooth, featureless void where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked up as it tilted its head, or at least, the space where its head should be, as if examining me. The world around me seemed to shrink, the trees leaning in, the darkness closing tighter. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was running, my legs churning without thought or coordination. The road blurred, my surroundings melting into a shadowy haze as terror propelled me forward. The smell grew stronger, and with it came a new sound: wet, heavy footfalls. It was chasing me. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. Not with that thing behind me. The world felt wrong, the air too thick, the ground too uneven. It was as if reality itself was unraveling, trying to drag me down. Finally, the road ended abruptly, spilling out into a clearing. At its center was a small, decrepit cabin, its windows dark, its door hanging slightly ajar. Desperation made the decision for me. I bolted inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The lock was broken, so I shoved a heavy, rotting chair against the handle. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The cabin was silent, but it wasn't empty. The air was thicker here, heavier, and every corner seemed to writhe with shadows that felt alive. The scent of rot was overwhelming, clinging to the walls, the floor, my skin. I backed into a corner, my eyes darting around for anything to defend myself with. A rusted knife lay abandoned on a table, its blade dull but sharp enough in a pinch. I grabbed it, clutching it tightly as I listened. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. Then, the sound began again, softer this time, almost deliberate. Whatever was out there was circling the cabin. I'm not sure how long I stood there, the knife trembling in my grip. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning. The sound stopped again, and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it had gone. And then I heard it. Not from outside, but behind me. A low, guttural sound, like a wet gasp or a sigh. My body refused to move, my eyes locked on the shadow stretching across the wall in front of me. Slowly, as if in a nightmare, I turned around. It was inside. Its form filled the doorway, larger than it should have been, impossibly wrong. The knife fell from my hand as its featureless face seemed to ripple, shapes pressing outward from the void as if trying to form something human. A faint whisper filled the air, unintelligible yet deafening, crawling into my ears, my mind. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. All I remember is waking up here, in the middle of the road, the faint glow of dawn breaking through the trees. My clothes were torn, my skin cold, and the world was silent once more. But the stillness wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. The snow fell in thick, suffocating flakes, blotting out the mountains that loomed like silent sentinels around the tiny Norwegian village of Hovde. It was the kind of snowfall that made the world feel smaller, the kind that muted even the strongest sounds. My footsteps crunched through the drifts as I followed the faint trail toward a place I shouldn't have been, an abandoned lodge perched on the edge of a frozen fjord. The locals avoided the lodge and had for years. Some said it was cursed. Others spoke of the skug, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, that whispered in voices no living person should hear. I dismissed their tales at first, but as a photographer in search of Norway's hidden mysteries, I couldn't resist when I heard of it. If there were any truths to their stories, my camera would capture them. The trek up the winding path was arduous, and the biting wind cut through every layer I wore. It felt as though the storm wanted to drive me back, to prevent me from reaching my destination. But I'd come too far to turn around now. The lodge finally came into view as a jagged silhouette against the storm. It was larger than I had imagined, a sprawling structure with sagging eaves and boarded-up windows. Its wood was weathered and gray, its roof bent under years of relentless snow. My breath came in ragged puffs as I approached the door, its once ornate carvings now obscured by frost and neglect. With a gloved hand, I pushed it open. It groaned like a wounded animal, the sound swallowed by the void inside. The air was colder within than without, heavy with a silence so profound it felt alive. The light from my headlamp carved out a narrow path, revealing scattered remnants of a past life, overturned chairs, a piano missing half its keys, and curtains that hung in frozen tatters. Every creak of the floor beneath me echoed unnaturally, as if the lodge had a voice of its own. I set up my camera in the main hall. The dim light spilling through gaps in the boarded windows created an eerie interplay of shadows, the kind photographers dream of. I snapped pictures of everything: the frost-laden staircase, the cracked mirror hanging on the wall, the pale shapes of snow drifting in through unseen cracks. It wasn't until I checked the camera's screen that I noticed something was wrong. In every photo there were shapes, vague outlines that hadn't been there moments before. Wisps of movement, suggestions of figures half-formed from darkness. At first, I blamed the snow, the fog of my own breath in the freezing air. But the more I looked, the less I believed that. The hair on my neck rose as I scanned the room. The shadows seemed denser now, less like absences of light and more like entities in their own right. I felt flushed. I shook off the unease and decided to explore further, chalking the feeling up to paranoia. The lodge's second floor was worse. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. The headlamp flickered as if struggling against something unseen. My footsteps slowed as I approached a room at the end of the hallway, the only door that was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and found what must have once been the master bedroom. The bed was still there, its frame warped and its mattress sagging. A mirror leaned against the far wall, its surface so grime-covered it barely reflected. But it wasn't the mirror that caught my attention. It was the writing. Faint but unmistakable, words were scratched into the wall above the bed. They were in Norwegian, a language I barely understood, but one word was repeated over and over again. Skug. Shut up. I reached for my camera, but before I could raise it, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that made the walls tremble. My headlamp failed completely, plunging me into darkness. I spun around, heart hammering, fumbling for the light. Then I heard it, a whisper, so faint I thought I had imagined it. It came again, closer this time, threading through the darkness like a snake. It wasn't a language I understood, but the tone carried an unmistakable malice. I scrambled for the door, clawing at the wood until my nails splintered. It wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, impossibly so. The whispers multiplied, overlapping, rising to a cacophony that seemed to come from every direction. And then I saw them, reflected in the grime-covered mirror, faint at first but growing clearer. Figures emerged from the shadows. They were human-like but wrong, their proportions stretched and distorted, their eyes glowing with a cold, pale light. One by one, they turned toward me. I screamed, throwing myself at the door with all my strength. It gave way, and I tumbled into the hallway, the whispers spilling out behind me like smoke. I didn't look back. I ran, the lodge groaning as if it were alive, its walls closing in as the shadows chased me. By the time I stumbled out into the snow, the storm had worsened. The lodge was gone, swallowed by the whiteout. I didn't stop running until I reached the village, gasping out my story to anyone who would listen. They didn't believe me. They smiled politely and spoke of imagination and tricks of the mind. But as I lay awake that night in the warmth of my rented cabin, I heard the whisper again, outside my window. The shadows had followed me home. Thanks for watching the video. Like, share and subscribe for more videos.